So good evening, everyone. My name is Sarah Pate, and I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Washington Center for the Book, an affiliate of the Library of Congress Center for the Book, and a partnership between the Washington State Library and the Seattle Public Library. The Washington Center for the Book promotes literacy and a love of books, reading, and libraries. We celebrate Washington's robust literary heritage and shine a spotlight on the contribution of reading and libraries in strengthening communities and in fostering civic engagement. One of our projects is the Washington State Book Awards, and we are thrilled to present the first in a series of online events with our 2020 Washington State Book Award winners with you here tonight. Our next event will be January 28th at 5:30 p.m. with Eric Liu, author of Become America, Civic Sermons on Love, Responsibility, and Democracy. And I'll put a link to that event in the chat after this introduction. We'd also like to thank our event partner for tonight and for this entire series, the Washington Library Association. I'd like to welcome Brianna Hoffman, WLA Executive Director, to say a few words.
Thanks, Sarah. Well, as Sarah said, I am Brianna Hoffman, and I am the Executive Director of the Washington Library Association. Since 1931, WLA has been a leader in the Washington library community with over 1,100 members from academic, public, special, and school libraries. We provide advocacy, professional development, and leadership opportunities while also promoting intellectual freedom and innovation. We are so honored to be partnering with our friends, the Washington Center for the Book, for this event series. On behalf of WLA, I want to thank you all so much for joining us tonight. And now back to Sarah to introduce our author.
Thanks, Brianna. Audience, as you have questions this evening for Karl, please put them in the Q&A section so that we can help facilitate getting your questions to Karl, to him when the Q&A begins. Karl Marlantes graduated from Yale University and was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University before serving as a Marine in Vietnam, where he was awarded the Navy Cross, the Bronze Star, 2 Navy Commendation Medals for Honor, 2 Purple Hearts, and 10 Air Medals. Along with Deep River, winner of the 2020 Washington State Book Award for Fiction, Marlantes is the author of the best-selling Matterhorn, an ALA notable book and winner of the Pacific Northwest Bookseller Association Award, and What It Is Like to Go to War, a Washington State Book Award finalist. He lives in rural Washington. Deep River is a rich family saga about Finnish immigrants who settle in Southwest Washington, set against the early labor movements, World War I, and the upheaval of early 20th century America. Karl Marlantes, thank you so much for being with us here today to talk to us about your work.
Great, thank you. I'm just, it's sort of, I can't see anybody. Is that the way it's supposed to be? All right, I'm sorry.
We see you.
This is new to me. Okay, you see me. Okay, that's all good. Well, hello everybody, and it's a great honor to be here. I feel like, you know, getting praise from peers is an ultimate for a writer, and you know, all these people with the Washington Book Award, the librarians and Center for the Book are definitely peers, and so I thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. I thought I'd talk a little bit about my background and why the book and how I got started on it, and maybe 15 minutes, and then we'll just open it up to questions from there. I grew up in Seaside, Oregon, and back in the day it was a logging town. It's now sort of a tourist town for people that can't afford to go to Sunshine. It's sort of a little cloudy and rainy there. But growing up in a logging town, it was an important part of what motivated me to write this book. It's hard to imagine what was like with the old growth forests. When I was in grade school, you would feel a log truck going through town. I mean, the floor would tremble in the grade school. You know, and your desk would tremble when the log truck went by. And there would be one log on, one, because they couldn't carry more than one log. They were that big, 10 feet in diameter, 12 feet, 14 sometimes, the monsters. They'd have to split them sometimes. They'd carry half of them. And it was a dangerous profession. The other profession was fishing. And I grew up working with my grandfather, and to this day, I regret how much complaining I did to my grandfather, because I would have to be out there in the middle of the night. And, I started fishing with him when I was about 13, helping him. He had lost his leg in a logging accident. And so my brother and I were pitched in on his fishing boat, which was a gill netter for salmon. And all I did was complain about, oh, I'm out here in the cold, and it's dark, and all my friends work in restaurants, and all the girls come in and see them whenever they want to, and they can eat all the ice cream they want. And I was just thinking, my poor grandfather, who emigrated from Finland to America to, be, form a better life for his family. He's got this kid sort of bitching and moaning about having to work on the fishing boat, not to mention the fact that I got paid more than I would have in a restaurant. But the thing is that it was an enormously dangerous. I mean, people drowned fishing. 5 of my friends growing up, and it was a little tiny high school. I mean, there were maybe 60 in my class, and 5 of them lost their fathers just during the time I was growing up. Church bells would ring, and people would go, uh-oh, what's that? And you knew that something had gone wrong, and people died. And this incredible danger and the bravery of these people, when you think about the old days when they did it by hand. I mean, my great uncle Yuka said sometimes it would be 2 days to get a tree down, because they did it just sawing, zoom, 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 14-foot diameter trees. And when I was doing the research, just gave you some idea, the image of a logger is a sort of big Hollywood sort of lump, it's lumberjack. We never use that word. But they're like wrestlers. They're aerobic machines. I mean, they work hard. And I was reading the input-output of a logging camp's mess hall, the kitchen, and the woman who wrote this up estimated that these loggers were burning 16,000 calories a day. That's work. And they work 12-hour days, 14-hour days, constant physical labor. And the effort and the bravery, because like I said, it's dangerous. I mean, cable snaps, there goes somebody's head, trees fall on you, logs roll on you. I mean, it's very dangerous work. And the irony of all that heroism was that we cut all the old growth forests down. 1972 in Clatsop County, which was right on the mouth of the Columbia on the Oregon side, was the peak cut. And as soon as it was over, it wasn't like it gradually declined. I mean, once the old growth forest was gone, it was gone. Boom. There's now like 30, 40 logs on a same size truck. They're that much smaller, and they grow them and cut them much faster. So there's this irony. And the other one that was an irony is that I read that building the Grand Coulee Dam, 72 men died building that dam, so that we could, click a light switch and get power, and we could irrigate apple orchards. And the irony of that heroism was that the Columbia River is a lake. I mean, it's a series of lakes now. There's the only wild stretch left goes through Hanford Nuclear Reservation. It's again. So I wanted to try and sort of write something about that. That was one of the motivations, is the irony of this heroism and not realizing what we were doing, and it's gone. There's no getting it back. The other thing that was a big part of it is that I grew up in this. My older brother coined the expression that we live in a cultural linguistic schizophrenia, because my father's first language was Greek, and my mother's first language was Finnish. I mean, they didn't really learn to speak English till they went to grade school, first grade. And these two cultures coming together, I can remember that I would go to the Greek Orthodox church with my grandmother. We'd drive to Portland once a year, and they'd be shouting at her. The priest would be up there, with the incense going and chanting, and people, Sophia, how are you? How are the kids? Oh, right in the middle of the service, just chaos. And then, of course, if you go to the Lutheran church where the Finns are, it's just like everybody is very quiet and very solemn. And these two cultures came together in my family. Not to mention that on my mother's side, my step grandfather, who I thought was my grandfather, his first language was Swedish, and my mother's biological father's first language was Norwegian, and of course my grandmother's first language was Finnish. So we had 5 languages batting around our house, not to mention a completely different set of cultures. One of my favorite stories, just to give you another idea of these cultures, is that my grandmother on the Finnish side was an atheist, strong communist. Didn't believe in the opiate of the masses one little bit. And my grandmother on the Greek side was Greek Orthodox, completely religious. And one of the problems of with the Greek Orthodox religion was that if you married outside of the religion back in the old days, it was considered an anathema, which meant you would go to hell. So just before World War II, my mom and dad fall in love with each other and they decide to get married. Well, my mother's mother, the Finn, thought this was ridiculous, that her daughter's going to marry somebody from one of these dirty Greek families. They don't even have saunas there. They just, and not only that, but they're superstitious people that believe in all this nonsense and everything. And she refused to go to the wedding. But my Greek Orthodox grandmother, who was convinced that her son was going to go to hell, went outside the church in mourning clothes and wailed the death song. And it's really hard to talk to people. I don't get any reactions, but it's just give you an idea of what it was like, growing up in this household. And that sort of went into the book, because I wanted to sort of talk about that immigrant experience along with the idea of the irony of the bravery and the cutting down of the old growth trees. And my Finnish grandmother was a real character, and she, to some extent, I thought about her when I wrote about the character Aino. And it wasn't her. Aino was way more romantic than my grandmother was, but my grandmother sort of inspired an idea for this character. My grandmother was in the IWW, and like I said, she was a fervent communist, held a grudge. One of the jokes about, they say, what Finnish Alzheimer's is? It's you forget everything except the grudges, and there's a bit of truth to that joke. I came home with a little boy once. I used to go up to Astoria where my grandmother lived, and I'd spend time there. And I met this little boy, and I thought, well, we'd be good friends. And so I invited him to Grandma's house, and she told him to go home, and said to me, just don't ever bring that boy here again. And, Grandma, what's this about? She says, his family are whites. They're church Finns, and we don't talk to them. I had no idea about the Civil War in Finland. And it was a horrible, horrible thing. Atrocities on both sides, real hatred. And even in the 50s, they still remembered. And I wasn't allowed to play with whites because we were reds, which to me, I didn't know what that was. In fact, one of the things that I always remember is I always thought the Daily Worker was the Astoria paper, because it was on my grandmother's table. I go up there as the Daily Worker. I figured out like when I was in high school that it was, the daily for the Communist Party. And, I have a different view of communists. This is my grandmother. She makes cookies and pies and I don't have this sort of bogeyman view of them that a lot of people do. And so I kind of thought, well, there's a radical, and I could sort of romanticize her a little bit. And one of the things that it also sort of triggered the book is I came home from college, and I was that was a time when, remember Joan Baez was singing this song about Joe Hill. I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. And it was a wonderful song about this labor organizer who wrote these songs that are even popular today. Pie in the Sky When You Die, Solidarity Forever. I mean, he was a big part of the labor movement, in particular the IWW, and he died. He was executed in Utah for murder, and of course, my grandmother said he was framed, and of course, the history books tend to say that maybe he did commit the murder, but he probably, even if he did it, he would have been framed anyway. So it's really hard to get to the bottom of it. But he did have clay feet, and but I came home from college and I asked my grandmother, I said, gosh, you were in the IWW. Did you know Joe Hill? And she literally took a step back, and in her accented English, that son of a bitch. And I thought, this is a cultural icon, Grandma, you know, what are you talking about? And so she told me that they would work several years to get people to do what they called carry the red card. And that was the IWW identification card. I mean, so it showed that you paid your dues, basically. And if you were caught being a member of the IWW, you'd get fired. And you not only would get fired, you would get blacklisted. And you couldn't get work to feed your family. It was serious. We live in a time where we have no idea of the struggles that the labor movement went through. And as she would say, she would work 2 years with other people, and then she'd say, and then we'd have a rally, and then the people in Portland would decide to send Joe Hill, and Joe Hill would come down and sing a few songs, and there'd be cops from all over the county standing around, and people scared to death and tearing up the cards. Joe Hill leaves and goes to California, and we're left with a bunch of torn up red cards. 2 years of organizing down the drain. So I thought, well, that's a different view of Joe Hill. And so I kind of took that to heart too, thinking about a character. I mean, my character is, I call him Joe Hill, but he's I don't know much. I mean, I read a lot about him, but he's kind of a mystery. We don't know really much about his interior life. So I had to sort of invent all that. And the other thing that went into the novel, which is an important part of it, is that I admit to being pretty much of a nerd. And when I was at Oxford, I took a class with Emily Dronke. Emily was the Sigmundson Professor of Ancient Icelandic Antiquities, and which is one of the great academic titles in the world. And she taught a course called Old Norse Poetic Diction. I talked my way into that course, and I think it was because I was older. I'd come back from the war, and when I was at Oxford, and I was the only one in the class that didn't speak Old Norse, and several other dead languages. But I got really interested in the Norse sagas, and Egil saga, Njal saga, Laxdala saga. And these are the sagas that were passed down word of mouth from the early Norwegian Vikings that settled Iceland, and the story of that settlement. And I started thinking, and this was 50 years ago, I started thinking, it wouldn't be great to write, the saga of the Finnish people coming to the Northwest and settling the Northwest. And it's sort of in the back of my mind. And that gets rattled around in there with all these other things I'm talking about. And I also got interested in the Kalevala, which is the Finnish national epic. It's like the Táin for the Irish, Cahulan and all those people. And this, or the Song of Roland for the French, Odyssey, Iliad. It's within that category, but it's different in the sense that it was a bunch of songs. There was a Swedish-speaking Finn named Elias Lönnrot, who was a doctor. And in the mid-19th century, I think it was like in the 1840s, he got his degree. And Finland was owned by Russia. And the Russian government required the young doctors to go to these districts that were distant, that didn't have doctors, for a couple of years. And he was sent to the Kalevala district, which is in the far eastern part of Finland, very remote, very isolated. I mean, in those days, days to just travel to get there. And he started to hear different songs. The old people would sing these songs, and he started to recognize that the same characters would sometimes appear in the songs, and the songs told stories, and he started to collect them. And what he did after a while, he had collected a lot of these songs, and when he came back from the Kalevala district, he put them together in what is now called the Kalevala, which was writing them all down. It was the first time they'd been written down. And it was at a time when Finland was starting to try to move for independence from Russia. And Russia was trying to Russify the place, and they were trying to stamp out the Finnish language. You couldn't use Finnish if you were dealing with government agencies. You couldn't use Finnish if you wanted to do anything official. And they were trying to, just basically integrate Finland completely into Russia. Well, the Finns did not want to do that. And just as that was going on, along comes this new Kalevala, this Finnish epic of really ancient Finland. I mean, scholars think that probably the characters in the Kalevala are probably very powerful shaman that were remembered in folk songs and lore. And the Finns are very different than the Norwegians, Swedes, and Danes. They don't have the same. There's no Thor or Odin or Freya or any of these Norse gods and goddesses. These are more nature spirits and more, like they said, shaman. And that whole piece of work became a touchstone for Finnish independence. And around the turn of the century, so the 20th century, Sibelius wrote a lot of music based on the Kalevala. So I sort of decided, well, I was going to wrap that all into it. And in fact, my first idea was I was going to just do the Kalevala and just move it to the Northwest. But there's no structure to it. After a while, I realized I couldn't make a novel out of it because there's no structure. I mean, it's not a saga, a story like the Iliad or the Odyssey. It's this collection with the same kind of characters. And so what I ended up with is my novel has characters who are clearly, if anybody reads the Kalevala, you'll know exactly who they are. But the story is completely made up. It's my story made up. But with these characters from the Kalevala. And part of what I was playing with as a writer, and I think writing is a kind of play, sophisticated play, but play nevertheless, is I was thinking about, you have an incident, which is in the beginning of the book, and each of these characters has a very different view of life, a sort of an outlook. And I guess a little bit of Kierkegaard got in there, that you have an attitude toward life. There's an aesthetic attitude, and that's sort of like, you stave off worries about death or fear of mortality by just being in the present and doing things that, make you happy right now. Power, money, sex, whatever, wine, good food. I mean, there's all kinds of healthy ways and unhealthy ways to satisfy this, but in the end, he says that you don't go far enough. Then there's a sort of a more ethical outlook, where you start to see the world and think about other people first instead of yourself first. I'm not sure I'm even there yet. And then there's what he calls the religious outlook, which that's in Fear and Trembling, where Abraham is asked to kill his own son and is willing to do it, which is beyond comprehension. And Kierkegaard's view is that's beyond comprehension. So my characters are a little bit more down to earth, but one of them just wants to get rich because he thinks that'll stave off this fear of death. There's another one in there, Yuka, who's just wants to wine, women, song. Then there's a traditionally religious figure, Ilmari, who was actually the smith Ilmarinen, and his view of the world, and he gets changed gradually because he meets Vasutati, who moves him into mysticism and his evolution there. And of course, Ino, who doesn't believe in any of that stuff, and her view is that she's going to make heaven on earth. She throws herself into the future by organizing and making the world a better place. But they all get along, and that's one of the things I was dealing with, is that this family loves each other, but they have incredibly different views of politics and views of life. And it was in the back of my mind that during this time that I hopefully just gotten through, that this country can love each other and still have these very different views about how to organize ourselves and how to get things done. We don't have to be enemies, and this family is an illustration of how you do that. Every Thanksgiving, they come together and argue with each other and still love each other. So that's kind of the background of it. I think I've blathered on long enough, so I'll turn it over to any questions.
Thank you so much, Karl, for that background. Your sort of inspiration for the book. I've got a couple questions that have come in, and folks are still welcome to add them as well to the Q&A. The first question that came in is, did your love of literature come from your family or someone specific in your early school years?
Mrs. Whitty, who was the librarian. Yes, librarians. The little town library shared the same building with the fire truck for the volunteer fire department. And she would sort of ask me questions about what I was interested in. And I mean, I'm like 8, you know, and the bookmobile came. I don't know if you guys remember bookmobiles, but the bookmobile came every other week to Seaside. And Mrs. Whitty would always have a book or two on there for me. And so when I was a little kid, I got through a lot of stuff that she would send my way and kind of tailor it for me, because she'd ask me questions. And you know, and eventually, I mean, by the time I was in, you know, got to high school, she got me into Schumpeter and Kierkegaard and some pretty heavy stuff. And she's an amazing influence on my life. And I think that's important. The first book that really hit me, the first literature, I mean, I did, you know, Dr. Seuss and all those. I mean, I loved them, but I remember it was Yeats's Celtic Twilight. And it's not poetry, it's prose, but he wrote down folk tales, and so I was going around, and there's pukas and banshees and, you know, noises in the wall and fairies, and I mean, it just sort of opened up my eyes. I'd walk around the woods looking for fairies, and got an idea of the power of literature that I didn't understand when I was reading it, but when I looked back on it, it was Mrs. Whitty and introducing me to some of that great stuff.
Oh, that's wonderful. Let's see, our next question. Your recollections of IWW are splendidly recalled in your stories of your grandmother. Another current Washington author, Jess Walter's new book, The Cold Millions, also details the labor history of IWW in 1909 Spokane. Where would you point readers interested in learning more about the IWW in Washington?
Well, there's just a bunch of books written about it, and I've got one of those memories like a sieve. I can't, but you can actually just Google IWW history, and there's a lot written about it, and a lot of the historical societies have it. I mean, Clatsop County Historical Society. I'm sure that there's Washington's, you know, University of Washington libraries. There's just a lot of labor history that's been recorded and put down. So that's where I would point you. And another thing is just good old, you know, internet. And it's amazing how much stuff comes up just on the internet, and then that leads you into some of the books that are more, you know, detailed, and you could probably trust them a little more than maybe Wikipedia. But I start with Wikipedia. It's a real good way to start.
Right. And the next question. Hi, Karl. First, thanks for a beautiful novel. I'm wondering about the character Ino. hope I said that correctly. I've only
I
read
know.
the name.
Yeah.
Is it I know? Okay, good. Her activism really resonated with me and made me think some of the modern activism we see today. Was that intentional?
Oh yes, I mean, that the whole novel is in my opinion incredibly relevant. I mean, immigration problems, income inequality problems, racism. I mean, you know, and I mean, in the novel, the Finns think the Greeks are just a bunch of dirty people. I got that from my own grandmother, and all of those problems that Aina was dealing with and organizing about are problems we have today, and we still need people to get out there and you know, carry the water. You know, I call it you know, doing the great work, and the great work is something that literature can help with, and organizing can help with, and you know, talking sensibly to friends can help with it. A sort of view of where it's all about. It's about consciousness, and that's a hard one thing to get. Thing. I wish I was a writer. I could have better words, but so yes, clearly I have in mind the same problems and how she approached them, and she, on the other hand, has a struggle, which again is very relevant. I mean, she's a woman. She wants to have a baby, and at the same time, she wants to spend her entire 24 hours a day organizing for the IWW. And hello, that just doesn't work. You know, you're going to have to figure out how to make it work. You're going to have to make choices. And so, I mean, that was very modern, still is modern problem. And so, I see her as a modern character. The other side of the coin, though, is that I always bristle a little bit when people put modern consciousness into, you know, characters from 200 years ago, and it just isn't the way they were. And you'll notice that Aino is really concerned about the one big union, and she doesn't mind getting her brother's coffee. I mean, that's just the way she was. And my own grandmother and all of her friends were like that. They were fighting a different fight.
Thank you. Another comment and question. Your work is an epic. How long did it take for you to write it?
Yeah, well, starting with the ideas, you know, 50 years, but I started writing it in about 2015, and the first draft was, you talk about epic, the first draft was enormous. And I'll tell you a funny story about it. I just was going like mad. I mean, for writers, first drafts are like, you know, romance and the honeymoon. Then comes the marriage, which is, you know, 8 drafts later. And but that first draft, I had a deadline for Grove, and it was 350,000 words, and I made the deadline and I sent it off, and I waited and I waited, not a single word. 4 weeks went by, 8 weeks went by, 10 weeks went by, and I finally got a 6-word email from Morgan Entricken, who's the president of Grove. Great stuff, too much of it. So I got on the phone with him. I said, well, Morgan, I said, you know, Anna Karenina is 351,000 words. And there's this pause, and he says, I could never sell Anna Karenina today, Karl. And the unsaid thing was, and you ain't Tolstoy. So I said, well, how much do you have to cut it? He said, can you cut it in half? And I went, oh God, I don't know. Well, I cut 100,000, 150, it's about 220,000 words now. So I cut probably 150 and added another 20,000 back, but the net cut from 350 to 220, that's 130,000 words. So yeah, it was an epic, and took me 4 years to do it.
Wow. What is your next project?
Well, my next one is going to be 50,000 words. And the first draft's done, and it's actually 52,000 words. But how do I put it? It's set in I'm going to set it in Helsinki in 1947. And it's not necessarily because I'm Finnish, but it's because my uncle was the military attaché to Helsinki, and he told me a story about getting into a ski race with a Russian. Yeah, this was in the 50s. He was fluent in Finnish, but he had gone to West Point, and I have come up with a story about the two wives, the wife of the American military attaché and the wife of the Russian military attaché. 1947, Stalin, Beria, the Soviet Union is trying to take over all of Eastern Europe. Finland is completely divided. Some people wanting to join the Soviet Union, some people terribly against it. They just finished a horrible war with the Russians. In order to fight the Russians, they were eventually overwhelmed. They had to join with the Germans. And so, I mean, just an incredible political situation. And I'm dealing with American naivete. I mean, the wife of the military attaché, who is actually the son of Matty from Deep River, Arnie. I planted it. Do you remember Arnie? It was beating on the drum and shouting "Kill the Boche" because World War I was going on. He was like a 3-year-old. Well, he ends up being this character in the next novel. It's sort of fun. They get into a ski race. They get drunk at an embassy party, and they're just soldiers. They're professional soldiers, and they're both great skiers. And they decide to do a race from the Arctic Circle to Kuopio, a town in the middle of Finland, and they're going to just sneak off and do it on their own. Well, Louise, who's the American, has an orphanage, and she wants to raise money for the orphanage. And so she gets the great idea that, oh, I'll just do a raffle, and we'll have people bet on what the time difference between the winner and the loser is going to be. And I'm titling this book "The Winner." And she decides to do a press release and go to the local paper to get money for her raffle. And she's just full of herself. And the Russian woman knows that, oh my God, her husband's a hero of the Soviet Union. And if he loses this ski race, it's all over. I mean, Siberia would be the least of their problems. He'd probably be killed and tortured, and who knows what would happen to her and her kids. And these two women have started out with a friendship, and Louise finally realizes how naive she's been, and she has decided, well, she's going to have to get Arnie to throw the race. But the rules of this cross-country race were once they leave, they can use no roads, and no one knows where they are. And she is desperate to try and get word to Arnie to have him throw the race so that, you know, if he wins, the husband of her friend doesn't die. And she relies on some of Arnie's relatives to try and go find him, but they hate Russians because they fought in the Winter War against them. And so even if they do find him, she doesn't know what they're going to tell him. So the novel is sort of has that tension built into it. And I'm dealing with, you know, what it's like to live in a world where there's no privacy. And hello, we're sort of getting there in a world where you don't know what the truth is. Even if you're talking to your husband, you don't know if he's saying what he's saying because he's supposed to, or saying what he's saying because he believes it. That's from the Russian side, and seeing it from the side of the American woman who learns that, you know, life in America is real different. So that's just finished the first draft of that.
Oh, thanks. Congratulations. Next comment and question. Intrigued with Sisu. Did you grow up with your Finnish grandparent telling you about this concept, or is this something that was more displayed and not spoken of?
Oh, geez. No, it was, I mean, if I fell down and started to cry, my mother would just go, "Where's your sisu? Get up." You know, ooh, you know, I mean, the word was used a lot. You know, if your lips started to quiver, it was, "Where's your sisu?" If you you know, slacked off running the race, it was like you lost your sisu. If you know, were out in the woods and you were lost and you got scared, it's like, "Where's your sisu? Get it up." You know, no, it was an incredible part of my growing up, and it's a big part of Finnish culture. And I don't know what it's like today in Finland, but it's certainly among the Finns that immigrated here and their children and grandchildren, sisu is a concept that is really just, part of our blood.
Fascinating. Thank you. Another question, were Ken Kesey or Joseph Conrad influential in your work?
I'm sure they were. I mean, I for example, I mean, Sometimes a Great Notion is his best novel. I think that One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest has become famous because of Jack Nicholson, not because of Ken Kesey. But Sometimes a Great Notion, wonderful, wonderful novel. And yes, I'm sure that was floating around in my head. Conrad, I've read, I guess 4 or 5 Joseph Conrad books, and my favorite is Nostromo. So I mean, writers are kind of like musicians. I think that you read good stuff and it gets kind of rattles around in there, and you hope you don't plagiarize it. But I'm sure it's a huge influence. A lot of these great writers. I just thought of, it was about music, but someone asked Miles Davis once what he should do to be a great jazz musician like Miles. As a young kid asking Miles, and Miles just looked at him and he said, "Listen, listen, listen." And for writers, it's read, 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 because all that stuff goes into the unconscious someplace and comes out later.
Thank you. Another question. I'm curious about the friendship of Ilmari and Vasutati and how they merged their beliefs, or was it one way? Ilmari growing towards hers.
It was certainly more Ilmari and Vasutati. Moving from a more fire and brimstone Christianity to a more mystical Christianity. And this has always been an interest of mine. I was baptized Greek Orthodox because I'd have gone to hell if I hadn't been. And we had to go to Portland, I guess, to get that done. No, the priest came down to Seaside once a year. Anyway, but I was raised in the Lutheran church, my mother's church. And, pretty standard Christianity, but I started getting interested in the Christian mystics, probably about my age 30 or 25 or 30 after the war, because a lot of things didn't make sense to me. And so my own journey has been more toward the mysticism, and all the great religions have mystic branches. The Sufis for the Muslims, St. John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, Meister Eckhart. I mean, a lot of these great Christian mystics are really worth reading, and so I started doing that, and so Ilmari, of course, starts off with an idea of a fearful God that is, but does send angels. I set him up a little bit, and I just had him modify his views. He's still very religious. He still believes, but it just starts to have more experiential sense of Christianity as opposed to a sense gained by listening to other people. One of my great moments was there was a man named Paul Reps who was a Zen Buddhist monk. He wrote a book called Zen Flesh, Zen Bones. You may have heard of it. But he stayed at our house, and he had a big lecture that night, but he had to mail something. I was living in Portland at the time, at the Lewis and Clark College post office, and that night at his lecture, somebody asked him. They said, what do we do to sort of get a more enlightened view of God, and what do you suggest? And this old man, he's in his late 80s. He gets this twinkle in his eye. He says, "Well, let me tell you this story." He said, "Today, I went down to the Lewis and Clark post office. I had to mail a package, but it was closed. And so I thought, well, I'll wait till it opens. It's only a few, going to be a half an hour or so. So I found this bench and I sat down on the bench, and it was a sunny day. And then he describes basically going into a Satori experience, this wonderful experience. And then he stops his story and he looks at the audience and he says, so if you want to have an experience like that, then you should go to the Lewis and Clark post office. And what he was saying is that organized religion is someone else's experience, not yours. And I kind of took that to heart. So that's where Ilmarie goes.
Thank you. Next question is, the book was so rich with historic details and references. Could you share with us some about your research process?
Well, first of all, reading, and that would get me going. And my process is I got just sort of a general idea of the time. I mean, I knew my history pretty well in a broad sense. World War I started, in 1914 with the Brits and the Germans, and then we got there in 17. And I mean, I had a sort of a timeline in my head. And then I with just that much knowledge, I started to write, and then I would focus my research, because I would have a scene, and I would go like, oh gosh, let's see, what was it like? What was happening then? And then I would, instead of just reading, generally everything, I would say, I need to know what was going on in 1908. In fact, in March of 1908, and specifically what was going on in, with the union movement, or what was going on in logging or whatever. So I could focus research that way. And the internet is just an incredible tool, and I use that a lot. The other thing that was really helpful is I grew up in a logging town. I knew what questions to ask, and I had done fishing for years, so I knew gill netting really well. So my own personal experience with logging and fishing. When we were kids, we'd go out to the shows, and they'd chase us away because it was so dangerous. But of course, we'd sneak back around to the other side, because it was just fascinating to watch a logging operation. I mean, it's unbelievably interesting, moving these giant logs and how they do that and everything. And I have relatives who are loggers today, and friends who have their own logging companies that I played football with. And so whenever I'd come up with something I'd need, or I'd want to describe something, I'd write it, and then I would call up one of these friends, and I'd say, listen to this, and I'd say, da da da. I'd say, oh God, Carl, you'd never rig it that way, and God, you'd kill somebody. You'd do it this way. Oh, okay. So I'd change it, because I had these friends. And I have this woman who's a really wonderful historical costume woman and expert, and I'd write a piece, and she'd come back, like one of the ones that I thought was, I just thought skirt lengths always got shorter. That was just the way they did. And she said, oh no, she said they got shorter till about 1920, and then they started getting longer. So if Ino is poor, she would come back with a short skirt instead of a long skirt. I go, oh, that's an interesting detail. And I got that because I have a friend who really knows her stuff. And I just, again, asking questions all the time that were specific. So when Ino comes back from Chicago, she's out of style. And but of course, her sister and her sister-in-law and her brother's wives, they don't know that. And so that was kind of fun. But I didn't find that by reading. I found that by talking to my friend who really knows her stuff.
Nice. Okay, we've got about 10 minutes left, and I'll just keep reading questions while we have the time. The next one is, how can we best support you as an author to make sure you are writing novels for many years to come?
Well, first of all, I think that just, getting a question like that makes me feel really good, that someone wants me to write more novels. I think it was Dylan Thomas, and I can only paraphrase him, but someone once asked him what it was like to be a writer, and he said, writing is a lonely and sullen craft. And it is a lonely craft. And I think the best way to support writers is to just tell them that you read their book and that you liked it, and ask questions. I mean, because God, I love to talk about my books. I mean, it's sort of like talking about your children, isn't it? It's like, I'll never get bored talking about my kids. So same with my books. I think that's a way that writers really need to be supported. You know, recommend your book club read the book and then discuss it, and that sort of thing. Obviously, you know, buying the books helps because it pays the mortgage. But I think that just things like this are very important. These kinds of forums, these kinds of prizes are a big part of motivating and keeping writers going, because it is kind of a lonely craft. I mean, you do it all by yourself and you don't know if you're a complete idiot or you have any talent or anything. And yeah, support.
Thank you. Okay, let's see. Are you familiar with Anne Proulx book, with the Anne Proulx book, Barkskins? And if so, did you see similar themes that might have influenced your vision for your novel?
You know, I know of the book. I've never read it, and so I don't know. I don't even know. I think it. I don't know if it came out before or after my book. So, but a lot other people have asked me about it, and it's one of those things. It's like, you know, I have a stack 2 miles high, and I'm not even through the 19th century yet. But so someday I should read it, and I don't know how to pronounce her name either. So it's got an X on it.
Okay, next question. Who or what was your inspiration for The Wise Woman in the Woods?
Basutati. When I was a little kid in Seaside, there was a woman who lived in a trailer camp who everybody called Indian Jenny. And I actually think Ken Kesey stole that name because from her, but it may not have. But anyway, she was named Indian Jenny, and she was rumored to be the last of the Clatsop Indians and was an Indian princess because her grandfather was Concomalee or something like that. And I used to go and watch her. I mean, I'd get on my bicycle. I was fascinated by her because she would, you know, she would walk around, you know, hang clothes on the washing line and stuff like that. I mean, I was stalking her, I suppose. I was about a 7-year-old kid, but there was something about being the last of the Clatsops. And I thought something struck me as a child. It's like, whoa, that must be something. So Indian Jenny was a big part of it. And as I said, I started reading mystics, and also there's a woman that is a Sufi, an American woman, but she is a Sufi, and I got to know her, and she told me a little bit about her journey, and so the amalgam of all that, and also, you know, I wanted very much for Vasutati to be a character that kind of represented the loss of the wisdom of the Native Americans. And I don't romanticize Native Americans. I mean, a lot of the animals that went extinct because they killed them. They're humans, but there's a lot of wisdom that we just ignored coming from Europe. And the basket weaving is a sort of a Zen in the art of archery kind of a process that Ilmri's daughter learned, and then of course she dies. And the understanding of the depth of the art of the basket weaving and the patterns, which represents that culture and that deeper wisdom that we've thrown away. And you know, oh, she gets 2 bits of basket for it. That was the comment from Ilmari's wife, Rauha. And Raha means money in Finnish, and Rauha means silver. So it's I'm playing with that a little bit too. She's a bit of Americana.
So the question that came after that one was also related to Vasutati. It says, Vasutati is the only indigenous character in the novel. Is that accurate for the time in Southwest Washington?
It certainly was accurate for the time in the logging communities. The Indians, I wouldn't say she's the only character, but you remember that there's Indians that you know, live in the villages along the Columbia, there were still quite, Indians, but no, I mean, quite frankly, I think that the Clatsop were pretty well gone and the Chinooks were pretty well gone by the 1920s. I think a lot of them had moved inland. There was I don't know my history that well, but I think that they were moved inland to around Centralia or someplace. Then there's a reservation north of South Bend, up in that area. But when I was growing up, there were none. Indian Jenny was the only one I ever ran across, except for my friend Charles Blacketeer, but he wasn't a Clatsop or a Chinook. He was from Warm Springs. He went to school with me. So by that time, that culture was really gone. And I think around the turn of the century, yes, there were far more, but they didn't integrate. I mean, they weren't part of that culture in the sense that the Finns and the loggers, the Indians just weren't really part of it. They were sort of out in the woods. But I do know that there were certainly way more than in the 50s when I was a kid. So I tried to stay true to the actual situation, which was that the Native Americans were, what was left of them were sort of isolated and weren't part of the community. So you didn't see them other than when they would come around, maybe to sell a basket or something.
Thank you. Okay, we are almost at 7, and I've got another one for you. Hopefully you have time to answer. Who are the authors you appreciate and read now?
Oh boy. Well, I like Jane Austen. I mean, I'm reading Jane Austen right now. My favorite one of hers is Persuasion. Tolstoy is my favorite writer. I mean, I just love to read Tolstoy. I mean, like I said, he can make a character out of a horse in 2 sentences, and I think he's just an amazing writer. And I like Dostoevsky, Brothers Karamazov. So in terms of the high-end literature, I really sort of like them. I think that I'm really bad trying to pull up names. It's embarrassing, but I read all the time. And right now, I'm trying to think of who am I reading besides this Jane Austen book that I'm just picking up. I'm sorry, I just blanked out. I can't come up with them.
Thank you, Karl, so much for being with us here today and discussing your work. This has been recorded and it will be going up on the Seattle Public Library's YouTube channel with captioning in the near future. Congratulations again on the award, and we look forward to your future works. Thank you, everyone, for being here.